Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Dragons don't exist, and I hate to say it, but they've never existed. So, if they've never existed, why are they in the folklore of almost every culture on Earth? Cultures that are separated by continents and oceans, and these dragons share a lot of similarities with one another. Dragon myths can be found in Europe, the Near East, India, the Far East, Mesoamerica, North America, at times when these cultures had no contact with one another. And some of the similarities in these cultures' dragon lore is that they're guardians of springs or other bodies of water, they're capable of flight, they can change shape or suddenly disappear, they have scales, horns, sometimes feathers, they're opposed to thunder or lightning or the sun. They terrify and capture young women. They have fiery breath. They can cause destructive acts of nature like tornadoes or floods or earthquakes. And they're a symbol of war and catastrophe. Lastly, they typically guard treasure. And there are all sorts of theories on why these dragon myths look so similar across cultures. Maybe ancient people looked at dinosaur bones and concluded that these were dragons. Maybe myth of Komodo dragons or whales came back to cultures. Maybe they're genetic memories of lizards that people have turned into these myths. Some think that very ancient genetic memories of dinosaurs embedded in mammals for millions of years have created the dragon myth. Maybe there's an Ur myth of dragons that started in ancient civilization, like Mesopotamia or Egypt, that spread across all other human civilization. Lastly, there's one researcher who thinks that dragons are a Jungian archetype, and they're actually a way for ancient humans to make sense of rainbows, of all things. In this episode, we're going to be looking at dragon myths in different civilizations and theories about where these myths come from and why it seems that these myths are so similar to one another. Some have argued that dragons really did exist because how else can you explain that somebody in the Western Hemisphere in South America in 1000 AD could have a similar myth to a medieval European in 1000 AD when these cultures were isolated from one another and had no contact and no ability to spread their myths from one civilization to another. So in our survey of dragon myths, we should probably start out with the culture that's most associated with them and arguably has the longest lasting dragon myth, and that is China. Their dragon myths go back more than 5,000 years. Dragons symbolized in Chinese imagery imperial rule and good fortune. Dragons of Chinese legend dwell in distant waters, and they can fly, even though they typically didn't have wings. They're thought to bring the rain and the fruits of the soil. So in the Chinese zodiac, dragon years are the most notable. And dragons appear in the forms of puppet costumes and New Year celebrations, boats and festive races, and ornamentation on buildings, and they're all over the place. So the dragon symbol is almost as omnipresent now as it was thousands of years ago. The Chinese design influenced dragon imagery in other Asian countries, in Japan and Vietnam, and reaching out to other parts of Southeast Asia. You can find the dragon on the flag of the small Himalayan nation of Bhutan. Now, there are some lines of continuity where we can trace the spread of the dragon myth historically, like in Zen Buddhism and the kanji script, but the farther back in time, the murkier things get. You see dragon-like monsters show up in the folklore of American Indians, North American plains, and among Mayan and Aztec civilizations, especially the serpent god Quetzalcoatl. Some even argue that you can find a dragon-like creature in the legends of the Inuit in northern Canada. And if dragon myth did start with one civilization and spread out, then you could argue all sorts of different ways of where it came from. Some say that the oldest legends aren't China, but from Mesopotamia, with stories of monster battles being the best candidates for early writings about dragons. In one Babylonian story, there's a serpentine deity monster called Tiamat that emerges from the sea to threaten all of creation with the return to primordial chaos. And the young god Marduk has to take up the challenge to fight him. He slays Tiamat and rescues the cosmos. Similar stories like this are found in the Old Testament. The book of Psalms and the book of Job tell how the God of Israel vanquishes the Leviathan, which is something like a whale and something like a snake. So in this version of the dragon myth, it's not so much a symbol of prosperity and power like in China, but more something that a hero has to defeat on his hero's journey. And you see echoes of this in Mediterranean and European traditions. Greek mythology includes battles with serpent monsters also. Zeus establishes his rule over the heavens and the earth by using a thunderbolt to kill Typhon, a dragon creature with snakes for legs that breathes fire. The Typhon myth can be found in other civilizations such as the Hittites. However, the beast found in these ancient myths isn't exactly like our modern-day understanding of a dragon. The word dragon comes from the Greek word drakon, but when the ancient Greeks used it, it seems more like a big snake than our winged dragon that we understand from Game of Thrones and J.R.R. Tolkien. The word drakon meant to watch, and to get an understanding of what ancient Greeks meant with this word, we can look at the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. This piece of outerwear was under the constant guard of a sleepless dragon. But Jason's paramour, Medea, is able to create a concoction that makes the dragon fall asleep. So in Greek myth, the dragon is a guard of treasure that you find also in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, the most famous instance of a dragon appears in the legend of St. George. There's a lot of different versions of this legend, but in the classic version, there's a fire-breathing dragon that terrorizes the Libyan city of Selene. The dragon demands tribute and first demands animals, but then he goes to humans, and eventually he demands the princess of the land. St. George rides to town on his horse, and when he learns of what the dragon is doing, he agrees to kill it as long as everyone there converts to Christianity. They do, and he kills a dragon, and this story can be found in all sorts of medieval manuscripts. The legend of St. George can't be traced back to one definitive story, but it seems to be cobbled together from all sorts of different sources. One popular subject in late antiquity for pre-Christian devotion in the Balkans was a rider on a horse that was usually rearing up on its hind legs, and the rider was spearing an animal, and sometimes he was beside a tree that a snake was curling itself around. In the Christian era, the rider was replaced with a saint in the same pose, but now he was killing a snake. Snakes became a shorthand for evil. The tradition of St. George is that he was born in Cappadocia, which is in modern-day Turkey, in the 3rd century AD. He was believed to be a soldier and refused to practice pagan worship, and may have burned down a Roman temple before Christianity was legalized by Constantine, and he was martyred for this reason. But there wasn't a connection between him and any sort of dragon story for centuries. Around the year 1000, George emerged as a protagonist in text form from the country of Georgia, and Georgia and England consider him the patron saint. During the era of the Crusades and afterwards, Crusader legends appeared, and Crusader knights learned the legend of St. George and spread his legend from the Eastern Mediterranean to Western Europe, and he became a mainstay of medieval legends. One last dragon myth I want to mention before we get into speculations about the origins of dragons is the Zamaj, the dragon lore from Slavic mythology, which is a little different twist from Western European or Chinese mythology about dragons. And they occupy an interesting place on the axis of belief about dragons. From one hand, you have Eastern Asian countries that regard dragons as symbols of power and strength and good fortune, compared to Western Europe, where dragons are viewed as evil creatures that are foils against a protagonist. But in Slavic folklore, you have the Zamaj. Dragons are viewed as either good or evil, depending on their sex. Male dragons in Bulgarian legends are believed to be the protectors of crops, but female ones are bent on destroying the fruits of farmers' labor. Other Slavic lands consider dragons to be a wicked beast, like in Western Europe, and in Russia and Ukraine, a dragon-like creature is a dangerous beast with 3 heads that spit out fire. In Serbia, the Zamaj is regarded as a benevolent being like the dragons in East Asia. The creatures are described as having a ram's head and a snake's body. These dragons are said to protect the people from the Azjada, a creature that is thought to bring bad weather and storms that destroy crops. The Zamaj are also thought to take on different forms, including human beings. In their human form, they indulge in their favorite activity, which is pursuing women. There's one other famous dragon I want to mention before looking into theories about the origins of dragons, and that is a monster in Beowulf. Specifically, the character of Grendel. This shows us how ideas of monsters change over time, and what could have been a dragon in the Middle Ages is very different of our idea of a dragon today of Smaug in The Hobbit or dragons in Game of Thrones. Beowulf was originally written in Old English and tells the story of a Scandinavian hero, Beowulf, and his attempts to aid the Danish king Hrothgar. One of the reasons Beowulf is needed is because he needs to kill a monster that's been plaguing the hall of Hrothgar. The monster is Grendel, who is maybe even more famous than Beowulf himself. The nature of Grendel is never made clear. Some have interpreted him as a giant or a dragon or a Scandinavian monster known as a berserker. He's described as a bipedal brute that has impenetrable scales and spikes in place of skin, and called a shadow walker in the text. The reason he's called that could indicate his preference for darkness and shadows, or it could mean that Grendel was initially intended to be interpreted as this. Because the story is set in Scandinavia, some argue that Grendel is a giant or a dragon. Giants are described in Norse sagas as abnormally large bipeds that live in the realm of fire. One giant named Ymir is credited in Norse mythology with creating the initial version of the world from his own limbs. The physical details of Grendel match those of a giant, because he had claws and fangs, and sometimes giants are mentioned as even possessing more than one head. The idea that Grendel could be a dragon falls more within a European interpretation of what dragons were like. That these creatures are covered in scales and they prefer to hide in caves and hoard their treasure from greedy men. But in medieval literature, dragons are more akin to serpents than modern versions we see today. Medieval Scandinavian dragons had legs which were tiny, and sometimes they had wings and sometimes they didn't. One dragon that gnaws on the Norse tree of life is described as able to fly. But all that to say, the emphasis on dragons as being serpentine doesn't really match up with Grendel's description as being humanoid. And there is another dragon in Beowulf that appears at the end of the story, so it makes it seem less probable that Grendel is another dragon for Beowulf to fight. So Grendel is probably a Scandinavian giant instead. But the fact that we're getting into this just shows how omnipresent dragons are all over the place in just about any culture's myth and folklore you can imagine. Now let's talk about different theories of where dragons came from in terms of myth. A popular approach is to think that they are faulty interpretations of bones or other extant animals. The most popular explanation of dragons is that they are misinterpreted dinosaur bones. Maybe ancient people discovered fossils and misinterpreted them as the remains of a dragon. We have an account from Shang Qiu, a Chinese historian from the 4th century BC, who mislabeled such a dinosaur fossil in the Sichuan province. If you look at a fossilized Stegosaurus, for example, you see a beast that's 30 feet in length, 14 feet tall, and covered in armored plates and spikes for defense. If you're an ancient person who saw such an unfathomably large creature with a long neck, it's easy to see that your imagination could wander. Maybe that patched together with a pterodactyl, where it's pretty obvious that there are large arms, it could have been wings, and put these different fossils together, and this is where a dragon could come from. And perhaps ancient people invented stories to explain what the beasts were. One dinosaur, the Qijiang Long, lived 160 million years ago and measured 49 feet in length. Its fossil has been uncovered in China and probably could have been found by ancient observers too. One paleontologist who studied this fossil, Tetsuto Miyashita of the University of Alberta, wonders what it would have been like for ancient people to discover such remains. He writes, "I wonder if the ancient Chinese stumbled upon a skeleton of a long-necked dinosaur like the Qijiang Long and pictured that mythical creature." And there's been evidence that the Chinese have been finding and studying dinosaur fossils as far back as the 4th century BC. Another animal that could be a contender for a misidentified dragon is the Nile crocodile. It's native to sub-Saharan Africa, and it may have had a more extensive range in ancient times, going up the Nile, and perhaps it inspired European dragon legends by swimming across the Mediterranean to Italy or Greece. The largest of all crocodiles, and they can reach up to 18 feet in length. They're also capable of a movement called the high walk, in which the trunk is elevated off the ground. So if you saw a giant lumbering crocodile, and you're a sailor who isn't educated, and sometimes you're out on the seas for a while, your imagination gets the best of you, this is another source that the legend could have come from. If you go further afield, let's go to Australia and take the iguana into consideration. Australia has a number of monitor lizards, also known as iguanas. They're large predatory animals that have razor-sharp teeth and claws and can rend their prey like a dragon does, and they're important figures in Aboriginal folklore. Some studies indicate that iguanas may have produced venom that caused bite victims' wounds to develop infections after an attack.